Hi, I'm Ryan Szymanski, curator for Battleship New Jersey Museum and Memorial. And this video is kind of a remake of one that we did way back in 2020. Hi, I'm Ryan Szymanski, curator for Battleship New Jersey Museum and Memorial. And today we're going to update you on our Teak deck repair process, where we're going to update the work on the Teak deck and talk about the process that we've been using here in Battleship New Jersey. Maybe we'll even compare and contrast it some of the processes that other ships have used. But because it's been 5 years since we made a video like this, we've gotten a lot of questions from many of our newer viewers about it. And quite honestly, the video that we've been sending them, like, oh, here's where we explained it, isn't the greatest. So apologies to those of you who have seen this before. It'll be a lot of similar information, but hopefully the audio will be a little bit better. So we are up here on the O2 level on the port side. This is one of the positions where a 5-inch gun was removed so that the overhead could be put in for the missile deck. When that was done, the Navy did not replace the original teak wood up here with new teak wood. They didn't even replace it with the laminate that they used elsewhere on the ship. They replaced it with straight Douglas fir. And it's kind of okay in here. The wood itself was in relatively good condition because it's protected by the overhanging missile deck. However, the steel underneath was not in good shape. Now, normally, we keep the ship angled a couple of degrees to one side and a couple of degrees down by the stern, and that is intentionally so we will shed water. Remember, this is not a problem for an active ship because when we're at sea, the ship is pitching and rolling and it's moving the water all over the place so they will eventually find the deck drains. Well, with us being stationary, the water doesn't find the deck drains. And when we had the ship in dry dock, she was sitting perfectly level. And we found at that time that water sat on this deck under the overhang and leaked into some of the staterooms down below that we hadn't previously believed were a problem. And so we had to prioritize coming up here to this space to see where the little pinhole was that was leaking. Well, it ended up not being a pinhole and it ended up not being one hole. We're showing you one of the worst areas, but it is far from the only one up here. We didn't run into issues like this while we were redecking on the main deck, which we finished a couple of months ago now, because the main deck is about 1.5 inches thick in most places. It serves as the decapping armor plate as part of the ship's system of protection. The superstructure is not like that at all. It is fractions of an inch thick, and so we have found and repaired leaks in a number of places in the superstructure before, and it's just what we expect at this point. So depending on the extent of the problem, we might weld a doubler plate over it, or we might weld a whole new plate over the entire deck. We've done both depending on the extent of the issue. So going to the actual process of redecking the ship. The first thing we do is we tear up the old wood. The studs, those are these things that hold the wood down, tend to be in lines. So we'll use a circular saw set to 2 inches of depth and just run a couple of parallel lines to get it under these so that you then have sections of the wood that don't have studs under them. We'll use like actually we have some here. We'll use pry bars like these or even some bigger like railroad type spike looking things to get under this wood and pry it up. Once we've got the wood up, then oftentimes we'll find the deck in one of two conditions. Check out over here. This deck got some maintenance later on in the ship's career, and you can see that the original primer, that green, probably a zinc chromate primer, is still relatively intact. And you can see the black material on top of it. That's not rust or corrosion or anything like that. That is some of the bedding compound that was put down. Sometimes that's a roofing tar type material. Sometimes it's more of like an oil, like a cosmoline preservative that will displace water. But regardless, it's supposed to fill in, because the steel isn't flat, the wood isn't necessarily flat. It's there to fill in any of the gaps so water can't get under it and sit. So you see the deck in this area is in relatively good condition. Alternatively, notice how the area of wood where they redecked kind of ends right here at this hard line. And you see over here, you've got rust bloom, scale. So we've got to use mechanical tools to chip that up. The mechanical tools are cheaper, but they're going to limit how long this new system of decking is effective. And that's going to impact what we do after this. So after we've hit this with mechanical tools, we end up with something like this area over here. So you can see we've gotten down to mostly white metal, but it's not all perfectly white metal at this point. So this is largely rust-free, and as we put our system of coatings down over top of it, that will prevent it from rusting. However, with the mechanical clean system, there's always going to be areas that you don't get all of the rust from, and that rust is going to continue to grow, and at some point, 30, 40 years down the line, that rust will have expanded and bloomed up to the point that it defeats the system of coatings on top of it and causes the wood to start to pop up and causes other deterioration. And it might even waste through the bottom and give you another hole like some of these. So knowing that for the money we have, we can't completely clean this to white metal and then put a system of coatings on it and know it'll be protected forever. We're not looking for a system of teak that will last forever. We're looking for something that will last for 30, 40 years. All right, so behind me, you can see some steel deck that hasn't been painted yet. You can see some steel deck that has a system of coatings on it that's ready for wood. You can see some underlayment wood, and you can see where we're laying out the above layer of teak. As originally built, Iowa-class battleships primarily were decked in 2 inches of Burmese teak. This provided insulation for the spaces under it, usually berthing compartments. For example, there's officer staterooms below where we are right now. The enlisted crew spaces are all below the main deck there, where, not all of them, but many of the spaces below the main deck there are living spaces. So this is, especially in World War II when the ship doesn't have air conditioning all over, is helping keep that sun from just cooking the steel and the guys under it, especially given that the ship was painted this dark blue color for much of the war. Also provides you better traction than smooth steel, so especially when the deck is wet, you're not likely to fall off. Teak is selected because it is a naturally oily tropical hardwood. It's not ideal for American purposes because it came from what was then a British colony. Earlier American battleships, like Texas, used 4-inch thick longleaf southern pine. It's something that was homegrown, relatively cheap, had to be replaced about once a decade, whereas teak will last at least twice that long. But, you know, we had plenty of it. The problem was the Washington naval treaties limited the weight of American ships, so by reducing the thickness of the material in half and doubling the strength of the material by going for a hardwood, the Navy was able to save weight on these ships, so they could invest more in guns, armor, things like that. Anyway, the cost of teak ended up being too expensive in the lifespan of the ships. Teak is designed to last about 20 years. The ship was designed to last about that long. But because she doesn't serve her 20 years consecutively like earlier battleships, she was put into service, taken out of service, put into service, taken out of service. Her decks deteriorated and they had to make repairs over time. Oftentimes, the types of repairs that they chose were cheaper laminates. Sometimes, like up above, they just used Douglas fir, which was cheap but didn't last long, kind of like a Band-Aid, especially near the end of the ship's career. Oftentimes, it was 1.5 inches of Douglas fir with a 1/2 inch of teak glued on top, so it would look like teak. It would provide the same insulation as teak, but it would not last nearly as long as teak. And in our case, when we got the ship as a museum, we found that the Douglas fir underneath had turned to mulch but the half-inch teak layer on top was still in relatively good condition until it wasn't supported underneath and you'd step on it and break in, and it became ankle breakers all over the place. So to make the ship safe enough to walk through, we really had to tear up that deck. And then our heating and electric bill goes up because now the insulation's gone that's holding the heat or air conditioning inside the ship and keeping the heat from the sun from cooking the ship. So it was critical that we started this roughly 5-year, $5 million project. Several other museum ships have also done this project. Alabama, Missouri, pretty noticeably, have completed their projects. They are so lucky that they are in southern climates where they can work nearly year-round. In New Jersey, where we have a winter, we couldn't do that. So rather than making planks of wood where we just laminated together and it was one plank like the Navy would have used, we came up with more of a panel system. We're using about 1 inch of marine-grade plywood as the base of the panel, and then we're using regular teak on top of it. It's still Burmese teak. It's just now 1 inch thick instead of 2 inches thick, and that cuts the cost by like a factor of 3 or 4 because the thicker it is, the more expensive it is, and that's not a straight line. It's more of a curve in the cost of that. So that means that we were able to do this for less, which means it was actually an attainable project. So we are bedding the plywood in a hydrophobic adhesive compound. We're still attaching it with the same style of stud system that the Navy would have used. However, because we're not using these long planks, we're able to use significantly less studs. Those studs are a point of failure. Coming over here to some of the teak, you can see the studs get capped with plugs. This part of the deck has not been sanded yet, so that'll get rid of all this overspray and where this is not flush. But water is able to get in here over time. It's obviously protected with adhesive and hydrophobic stuff, but over time that breaks down, water gets in, and now each of these holes that's cut into the plank will allow water to get through to the steel underneath. And that's really where the issue is. We're less worried about the wood rotting, more worried about the steel underneath getting wet and starting to bloom up and then breaking these studs and the wood coming apart. So we put down the plywood, it's fastened down with studs. We then put down more adhesive, put the teak boards over top of it. So now it's all laminated together. And then we use like regular deck screws in here to further fasten the teak to the plywood underneath. And to preserve the original look of the ship, something that was both important to the museum and to the State Historic Preservation Officer, which approved the changes, the modifications we're making to the artifact, we then put the traditional sized plugs over those screw holes. Even though they're significantly smaller than that, it retains the original look of the deck, which was something that was very important to us. And likewise, we're using this modern caulk, just like the Navy would have used historically, to fill in the gaps between the planks. That will also give it room as it gets hot or wet to expand and contract, and this will flex with it, so much like expansion joints and bridges and things like that. So that's the system we're using. An Iowa-class battleship has about 43,000 square feet of teak deck. That's about 1 acre. And we have finished about 3/4 of it over the last several years. The entire main deck is done, which means, I believe for the first time in the history of the museum, guests can take a walk around the entire main deck. Previously, some areas were so badly deteriorated that it was tripping hazards and we had to have it roped off and you couldn't go around the entire deck, but now you can. Earlier in the video, I mentioned that in comparison to what some other museum ships are doing, Missouri was redecking around the same time we did. They got completed a little bit earlier than us. They were able to do a much better treatment of their steel deck, and so rather than using an underlayer of wood like we did, they used a system that's more expensive but will last a lot longer. So they were able to attain white metal, and then they poured about 1 inch of epoxy compound on top of that. And in theory, assuming that they did get all white metal, then that's going to just prevent rust in the future. It will not rust through from the top. It's more likely to rust through from the bottom at that point. And then they put an inch of teak over that. So similar idea. Theirs will almost certainly last much longer. That system wouldn't have worked for us. We couldn't afford it in the first place. And since we couldn't get the same level of surface prep that they got, we couldn't get it to completely white metal, we would have been throwing that money away anyway because we would have still had rust under that epoxy. Working with New Jersey State Historic Preservation officers, it became important both to the museum and to them that we redeck the ship so that it looks and performs as similarly to the original as possible. And so we decided to go with teak as the material that we were putting down on top in place of look-alike materials. Those look-alike materials potentially will last longer, assuming the surface prep is acceptable. But since we were only able to mechanically clean the deck, likewise to Missouri's epoxy and teak laminate, a fake wood alternative just would outlast the steel underneath. And quite frankly, in 30 or 40 years, we're going to have to get rid of this deck and treat the steel underneath again. Your support for this project is very important. It's what's going to let us finish this last quarter of the project. All of the historic wood that we are ripping up, that's in good enough condition. Obviously, like I said, some of the fir material was turning to mulch, but all of the material that we have been ripping up, we have been selling in the museum store. And all of the proceeds for that go back into the restoration of the teak wood deck. So if you want a historic piece of the Battleship, there are several options available. We're selling it as just raw wood in several sizes. So as we cut it up, just like here's a block of original teak, we haven't messed with it. Our volunteers are also working on it in the ship's original carpentry shop and making a variety of teak wood products out of it that again are for sale in the gift shop that goes back into the preservation of the museum. So there's a link to that in the description below. Please check it out, see if there's something that catches your eye. Again, it all goes back into the restoration of the wood deck on the ship. If you've already picked up a piece, let us know in the comment section down below what you got and what you did with it. Battleship New Jersey receives operating support from the New Jersey Department of State, also from a number of other businesses and private individuals like yourselves. We really appreciate your support. There's a link in the description below for ways to donate to support the museum. You can also support us by liking, sharing, and subscribing so more people find about the museum and our channel. Thanks for watching.